Life, when you realize something unsettling yet powerful. Support is not guaranteed, understanding is not automatic, and sometimes even those closest to you will question the very thing that keeps you awake at night with purpose. In that space, where approval fades and doubt grows louder, you are left with a choice that defines everything: to shrink under the weight of opposition, or to rise quietly with a strength no one taught you, but life demanded you discover. There are moments in life when doubt does not arrive like a stranger at the door. It arrives like familiar voices, like people who once sat close to your hopes and now stand at a distance from your vision. And in those moments, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside you. You start questioning whether you should slow down your direction just to make others comfortable with your path. But not everyone who doubts you deserves access to your direction, because your direction was never designed to be a group decision. You begin to understand that doubt is not always born from hatred. Sometimes it is born from limitation. People can only guide you as far as they have gone themselves. And when you begin to move beyond their experience, their certainty turns into confusion. They may not see what you see, not because it is not real, but because it has not yet become familiar to them. And unfamiliar things are often mistaken for impossible things. So you must learn a quiet discipline, the discipline of not explaining every step of your becoming. There is a kind of strength that does not argue, does not over-explain, does not beg to be believed. It simply continues. Because when you begin to pause your progress to answer every doubt thrown your way, you are no longer walking your path. You are reacting to someone else's uncertainty. There will be voices that question your timing, your choices, your direction. Some will come disguised as concern, others as certainty. But even concern can become a cage if you allow it to decide your limits. You are not required to make your dreams understandable to everyone before you are allowed to pursue them. Growth is not a committee decision, and still, there is something deeply human in wanting to be understood. It aches when people you respect cannot see what you are building. But you must not trade your clarity for their comfort, because the moment you begin to reshape your vision to fit their understanding, you risk shrinking something that was meant to expand you. So you keep walking, not with anger, not with pride, but with a steady remembrance that your direction was given to you, not to the crowd. And in time, something remarkable happens. The same distance that once felt like isolation becomes evidence of progress. The same doubts that once felt heavy become quiet in the presence of results. And you realize then that not everyone needed to believe in the beginning for the outcome to be real in the end. When support disappears, something within you is forced to mature in a way comfort never allowed. At first, it feels like loss of encouragement, loss of reassurance, loss of the familiar voices that once made the journey feel lighter. But slowly, you begin to recognize that what has left was not your purpose, but only the applause around it. And applause, as powerful as it feels, was never meant to be the foundation of your progress. There is a shift that happens in silence. You stop waiting for someone to remind you of your direction. You stop depending on motivation that arrives and disappears like passing weather. Instead, you begin to build something steadier within yourself. Discipline does not shout, it does not fluctuate, it does not ask how you feel before it tells you what must be done. It simply stands there, unwavering, when everything else has stepped away. And in that space where encouragement once lived, discipline begins to take root. It becomes the quiet agreement you make with yourself each morning to continue even when no one is watching, even when no one is clapping, even when the outcome feels distant. This is where real transformation begins, not in the presence of support, but in its absence. It is easy to move forward when the world is cheering. It is far more meaningful, though, to continue when the room is empty. Because empty rooms do not lie to you. They do not inflate your confidence or distort your effort. They simply reflect you back to yourself. And in that reflection, you are forced to confront a simple truth. If you are to become what you envision, you must learn to rely on structure instead of emotion. Discipline does not ask for perfect conditions. It does not wait for approval. It teaches you to act even when doubt is present, even when energy is low, even when progress feels invisible. And over time, what once felt like effort begins to feel like identity. You are no longer trying to be consistent, you become consistency itself. There will still be days when absence is felt more sharply than presence ever was. Days when you remember how it felt to be encouraged, to be believed in, to be seen. But even in that remembrance, you begin to understand something deeper. Support was never meant to carry you forever. It was meant to introduce you to your own capability. And so you continue, not because the world is behind you, but because something within you has learned to stand without it. There comes a point in every journey where words lose their weight, where explanations no longer open doors, and where defending your choices becomes less important than demonstrating them. In that space, something quieter begins to speak on your behalf. It is not emotion, it is not persuasion, it is consistency. And it does not arrive suddenly, it is built day by day, in moments that no one applauds and in hours that no one witnesses. At first, consistency feels unremarkable. It does not carry the excitement of motivation, nor the intensity of inspiration. It feels ordinary, almost invisible. You show up, you repeat, you continue. And in a world that often rewards loud beginnings, this quiet repetition can feel like it is going unnoticed. But consistency is never silent in its effect. It is only slow in its reveal. There will always be voices that demand proof before patience, certainty before understanding, and results before effort has matured. Yet consistency does not rush to satisfy those voices. It does not negotiate with doubt or argue with disbelief. Instead, it continues its work with a kind of calm certainty that does not depend on being believed in order to exist. And slowly, something begins to change. What once looked like repetition begins to take shape as progress. What once seemed small begins to accumulate into something undeniable. People who once questioned your direction start to notice your distance from where you began. Not because you announced it, but because you lived it. Consistency has a way of rewriting conversations without ever entering them. It answers questions you never responded to. It resolves doubts you never debated. It builds evidence in motion, not in argument. And over time, it becomes louder than any explanation you could have offered. There is a particular strength in not needing to convince others while you are still becoming. Because convincing requires energy that consistency reserves for creation. And creation, when sustained long enough, does something arguments never can. It transforms perception without asking permission. Even when no one acknowledges it at first, consistency is still speaking. It speaks in early mornings when you choose effort over ease. It speaks in late hours when you continue long after motivation has faded. It speaks in repetition that feels ordinary until it becomes extraordinary in hindsight. And then, one day, without announcement or warning, you realize that your actions have outgrown your explanations. You are no longer being questioned in the same way you once were, not because everyone suddenly agrees with you, but because what you have built is now doing the talking for you. That is the quiet power of consistency. It does not argue its worth, it becomes it. Opposition has a strange way of arriving early, often before anything you have built has had the chance to fully reveal itself. It does not wait for completion, nor does it pause for understanding. It shows up in the middle of your forming, when your ideas are still fragile and your confidence is still learning how to stand on its own. And in that timing, it can feel unfair, as though you are being judged by a world that has not yet seen the final version of who you are becoming. But opposition is not always a sign that you are wrong. More often, it is a sign that you are early. And being early in your purpose can look very similar to being out of place. People tend to respond more comfortably to what is already familiar than to what is still unfolding. So when you begin to move in a direction that has not yet been widely understood, resistance is not an exception, it is almost expected. There is something important to recognize in that resistance. It does not necessarily define the value of your path. It often reflects the distance between your vision and other people's exposure to it. What you are building exists first in your mind, then in your actions, and only later in the understanding of others. That delay is where opposition often takes root, not because the path lacks meaning, but because meaning has not yet had time to be seen. And yet, opposition has a strange dual nature. It can feel like a barrier, but it can also serve as a kind of confirmation. Because what rarely matters enough to challenge, rarely matters enough to change anything. If your direction drew no reaction at all, it might simply mean it is too small to disturb anything beyond itself. But when it begins to meet resistance, it is often because it is moving towards something larger than comfort allows. Still, it takes maturity to hold that perspective while you are in the middle of it. When you are the one being questioned, misunderstood, or underestimated, it is easy to interpret opposition as a signal to stop. But stopping would assume that the early discomfort is the final verdict rather than the opening phase of something still developing. There is a quiet discipline required to continue in the presence of doubt without letting it reshape your direction. You begin to understand that not every obstacle is placed to block you. Some are placed to reveal whether you are willing to proceed without immediate validation. And in that willingness, something within you strengthens in a way comfort never could have taught. Over time, opposition loses its authority. It remains present, but it no longer defines the meaning of your movement. What once felt like resistance begins to feel like recognition delayed. And when recognition finally arrives, it rarely feels surprising. It feels like something that had to catch up with what you had already chosen to become. Clarity is a quiet kind of power, the kind that does not depend on noise or recognition to prove its existence. It does not rise and fall with opinion. It does not change shape depending on who is watching. It simply remains steady within you, even when everything outside of you is uncertain. And when applause fades or never arrives at all, it is clarity that decides whether you continue or collapse under the weight of silence. There is something fragile about applause when it becomes the reason for movement. It feels good, it lifts the spirit, it can even create momentum. But applause is external, and anything external is unstable by nature. It can be given freely, and it can be taken away just as easily. If your direction depends on it, then your direction will always be at the mercy of other people's attention, and attention is one of the most unpredictable forces you will ever encounter. Clarity, however, does not depend on attention. It is built in the moments when no one is clapping, when no one is watching, when no one is confirming that you are on the right path. It is the internal agreement you make with yourself that says, I understand why I am here, even if no one else does yet. And that understanding becomes stronger every time you choose action over doubt. When clarity is present, you do not need to constantly be reassured. You may still feel uncertainty, but it does not decide your direction. You may still face silence, but it does not erase your purpose. You begin to move differently, not because everything is easy, but because something within you has become certain enough to keep going even when ease is absent. And this is where many people struggle, not because they lack ability, but because they mistake silence for failure. They begin to think that if something is not being noticed, it must not be working. But clarity teaches a different language. It teaches that progress is not always visible at the beginning, and that some of the most meaningful movements in life happen long before they are recognized by anyone else. There will be days when applause would feel comforting, when encouragement would make the path lighter, when recognition would make the effort feel seen. That desire is natural. But clarity asks you to hold something deeper than desire. It asks you to hold direction, because desire can shift with circumstances, but direction keeps you anchored even when circumstances change. And over time, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You stop measuring your progress by how loudly it is acknowledged and start measuring it by how faithfully you are aligned with what you set out to do. The need for constant validation begins to lose its grip, not because you stop caring, but because you start understanding. You realize that applause is temporary, but clarity is structural. Applause visits your journey, clarity builds it. And when the noise fades, it is not applause that carries you forward. It is the certainty that you know exactly why you continued when it was quiet. People may question your vision because they cannot see from your perspective, and that is not a flaw in your direction, it is a limitation of distance. Vision, by its nature, arrives before understanding. It is carried first in the mind of the one who receives it, not in the eyes of those who observe it from the outside, and what is not yet visible often becomes the easiest thing to doubt. It is a peculiar experience to hold something within you that feels so real, so structured in feeling, yet so unformed in the perception of others. You can almost see it fully, even when it has not yet taken shape in the physical world. But when you try to describe it, you discover that language often falls short of lived clarity. So you speak, and sometimes you are met with hesitation, confusion, or even dismissal. Not because your vision lacks truth, but because truth has not yet taken a form that others can easily recognize. And in that gap between what you see and what they see, misunderstanding is born. People interpret what they cannot visualize through the lens of what they already know. If your vision does not resemble their experience, they may assume it cannot exist, not out of cruelty, but out of familiarity. Familiarity is a strong force. It shapes belief more than logic often does. But you are not required to shrink your vision to match someone else's frame of reference. Growth has never been comfortable to explain in its early stages. Everything that is now accepted once looked uncertain. Everything that is now admired once had to survive being questioned. And what survives questioning often becomes stronger for it. There is a quiet discipline in continuing to build what others cannot yet see. It requires you to trust something internal more than something external, because external validation is delayed, but internal clarity is immediate. And if you wait for others to see what you see before you act on it, you will always be one step behind your own potential. So you learn to move differently. You begin to build in silence, refine in silence, adjust in silence, not because you are hiding, but because you are forming something that does not yet need to be explained to survive. There is a stage in every creation where explanation is premature, where exposure can weaken what is still becoming strong. And slowly, something shifts. What once required explanation begins to require only presence. You no longer need to describe every detail for it to be taken seriously, because the work begins to speak in a language more convincing than words. It becomes visible not through persuasion, but through evidence. Then one day, those who questioned your vision begin to see it not as an idea, but as something existing in reality. And in that moment, what once felt like misunderstanding is revealed to have been only distance in time, not absence of truth. Strength does not announce itself when it is being formed. It does not arrive with recognition, nor does it depend on agreement to take shape. In fact, it is often in the absence of agreement that it begins to grow in its most honest form. When no one is aligning with your thoughts, when no one is echoing your belief, when no one is confirming your direction, something deeper is required from you. You're no longer carried by collective certainty. You are asked to stand on individual conviction. In moments of agreement, life feels lighter. You are supported, affirmed, understood. There is a natural ease in moving alongside others who see what you see, but ease does not always create endurance. It is in isolation that endurance is tested, not because isolation is cruel, but because it removes everything that is not essential. What remains is you, your intention, and your willingness to continue without reinforcement. At first, isolation can feel like absence, the absence of voices, the absence of shared enthusiasm, the absence of reassurance that you are moving correctly. But over time, if you do not resist it, that absence begins to transform. It becomes space, space to think without interruption, space to refine without pressure, space to listen more closely to what you actually believe, rather than what you are told to believe. There is a quiet refinement that happens when you are no longer adjusting your direction to match the comfort of agreement. You begin to notice the difference between influence and alignment. Influence is external. It shifts with opinion. Alignment is internal. It remains steady even when opinion changes. And strength begins to form in that alignment, not because everything around you supports it, but because you choose to maintain it anyway. Isolation teaches something agreement rarely can. It teaches self-reliance of thought. You stop outsourcing certainty. You stop waiting for validation before taking the next step. Instead, you begin to test your own reasoning, your own intuition, your own understanding of where you are going. And in doing so, your inner voice becomes clearer, not louder, but more precise. There will be moments when you miss agreement, when the weight of standing alone feels heavier than expected. That feeling is natural. Humans are built to connect, to share, to confirm. But not every stage of growth is designed to be shared at the beginning. Some parts of becoming are meant to be endured privately, not because they are less valuable, but because they are still forming their strength. And slowly, without announcement, something changes. What once felt like isolation begins to feel like grounding. You are no longer easily swayed, no longer dependent on consensus to proceed. You begin to move with a steadiness that does not require external permission, and that steadiness becomes your strength, not because others agreed with it, but because you learned how to hold it when they did not. Winning, in its deepest sense, is often misunderstood. It is frequently imagined as a moment of arrival, a visible victory over circumstance, competition, or resistance. But there is a quieter truth beneath that surface idea, one that does not depend on comparison at all. Real winning is not the act of standing above others. It is the act of standing firmly within yourself when everything around you tries to pull you away from who you are becoming. There are moments when life will tempt you to abandon parts of yourself simply to make the journey easier, to soften your voice so it disturbs fewer people, to reduce your vision so it feels less threatening to those who cannot yet understand it, to delay your purpose so it fits more comfortably into someone else's expectations. And in those moments, the real challenge is not external, it is internal. It is the quiet negotiation between who you are and who you are being pressured to become. Abandoning yourself rarely happens all at once. It happens slowly, in small compromises that feel harmless in isolation, a decision made for approval instead of alignment, a silence chosen out of fear instead of truth, a direction adjusted not because it is wrong, but because it is inconvenient to others. And over time, if these moments are not recognized, you can find yourself far from your original center, wondering when you began to feel unfamiliar in your own life. But refusing to abandon yourself is not a dramatic act. It is not loud or performative. It is often quiet, private, and consistent. It is the decision to remain honest with your own understanding, even when it is not popular. It is the discipline of returning to your own clarity when external noise becomes overwhelming. It is the courage to continue choosing what aligns with your values, even when no one is applauding that choice. There is a kind of strength that does not need to defeat others because it is not in competition with them. It is rooted in integrity rather than opposition. And integrity does not require comparison to exist. It simply requires consistency between what you believe and how you act, especially when no one is watching. And slowly, something powerful begins to happen. The more you refuse to abandon yourself, the less you are shaken by external judgment. Opinions still exist, challenges still appear, misunderstandings still arise, but they no longer have the same authority over your direction. You begin to realize that losing yourself would cost far more than losing approval ever could. In time, what once felt like resistance begins to feel like refinement. You understand more clearly what is essential and what is not. You learn that not every voice deserves a vote in your direction. And you recognize that the most meaningful victory is not in proving others wrong, but in remaining true enough to yourself that you no longer need to be proven right by anyone else. There is something deeply unsettling and at the same time profoundly liberating about rising without permission. It unsettles because it goes against the way many people are taught to move through life, waiting for approval, waiting for validation, waiting for a signal that says, now you may begin. But life rarely gives such signals. More often, it gives silence, and in that silence, you are forced to decide whether you will remain still or begin anyway. To rise without permission is not an act of rebellion for the sake of defiance. It is an act of responsibility toward what you carry within you. Because if your purpose depends entirely on external approval, then it is not yet fully yours. It is still being negotiated in the hands of others. And anything that is constantly negotiated will always be delayed. There is a moment in every meaningful journey when you realize that waiting has already taken too much from you. Waiting for understanding, waiting for support, waiting for timing that feels universally approved. And in that realization, something shifts. You begin to understand that permission is often just another form of delay dressed as caution. So you begin anyway, and at first it does not feel powerful. It feels uncertain, even vulnerable, because stepping forward without permission means stepping forward without guaranteed acceptance. It means accepting that misunderstanding may accompany you for a while. It means learning to move while being questioned. But movement, even uncertain movement, has a different energy than stillness disguised as preparation. As you continue, something begins to change, not in the world immediately, but within you first. You start to develop a steadiness that does not rely on agreement. You begin to trust your own judgment in a way that does not collapse under external doubt. And slowly, permission becomes irrelevant, not because opposition disappears, but because it no longer defines your ability to proceed. There is a quiet power in that state. You stop asking whether you are allowed and start focusing on whether you are aligned. And alignment is a far more honest guide than permission ever was. Permission comes from outside you. Alignment comes from within you. One can be delayed indefinitely. The other can be chosen at any moment. And over time, something undeniable happens. What once required justification begins to require only evidence. What once needed approval begins to stand on its own results. People who once questioned your right to begin to observe your progress without needing an explanation for its existence. That is how impossibility begins to shift, not through sudden transformation, but through consistent movement without waiting to be authorized. And in that quiet persistence, the definition of what was considered possible begins to expand. Not because the world changed its mind first, but because you refused to let its hesitation define your limits.